Picture this. It's 1574 and King Henry III of France is touring Venice. He's expecting the usual royal treatment, fancy dinners, boring speeches, maybe a nice gondola ride. Instead, the Venetians decide to show off. They take him to a massive walled complex on the edge of the city and tell him to watch. In the time it takes him to eat lunch, they build an entire warship from scratch, not repair one, not finish one that was half done. They literally construct a complete galley, fully armed and ready for battle, faster than most people today can assemble IKEA furniture. The French king's jaw hit the floor so hard, it probably left a dent. This wasn't magic. This wasn't some medieval publicity stunt. This was the Venetian Arsenal, and it was about to change how the world thought about manufacturing forever. While most of Europe was still building ships the same way they'd been doing it since Noah, Venice had quietly created something that wouldn't be seen again until Henry Ford started making cars. They'd built the world's first assembly line, and they were using it to pump out warships like a medieval military machine. Here's the thing that blows my mind about this place. We're talking about the 1400s and 1500s. Most people couldn't even read, let alone organize complex industrial operations. But Venice had figured out something that would take the rest of the world centuries to catch up to. They'd cracked the code on mass production, standardization, and supply chain management, all while wearing funny hats and speaking Italian. The Arsenal wasn't just a shipyard. It was a 60-acre fortress of innovation that employed over 16,000 workers at its peak. That's bigger than most towns back then. These weren't just random guys with hammers either. They were specialized craftsmen who'd perfected their tiny piece of a massive puzzle. Each one knew exactly what to do, when to do it, and how fast it needed to be done. It was like watching a giant clock made of people, wood, and iron, all ticking together in perfect time. But why did Venice need this incredible shipbuilding machine in the first place? Simple. Money. Venice was the Amazon of the medieval world, except instead of delivering packages, they were moving spices, silk, and precious metals across the Mediterranean. Every Venetian merchant ship that made it safely to Constantinople or Alexandria was basically a floating treasure chest. Every one that got captured by pirates or enemy navies was a financial disaster that could bankrupt entire families. The math was brutal. Venice's entire economy depended on controlling sea trade routes, and controlling those routes meant having more ships than anyone else. Not just any ships either. Fast ships, tough ships, ships that could outfight pirates and outrun enemy fleets. The problem was that traditional shipbuilding was slower than Christmas morning. Most shipyards could maybe finish one decent galley per year if they were lucky and worked non-stop. Venice needed dozens of ships, and they needed them yesterday. So they did what any sensible republic would do. They completely revolutionized an entire industry from the ground up. The Arsenal became their secret weapon, their ace in the hole, their way of making sure that while other nations were still arguing about who should build their next ship, Venice already had 10 new ones patrolling the trade routes. Walking into the Arsenal in its heyday must have been like stepping into the future. Imagine being used to tiny workshops where one old guy spent months crafting a single boat, then suddenly finding yourself in this massive complex where hundreds of workers were coordinating like dancers in the world's most productive ballet. The noise alone would have been incredible. Hammering, sawing, shouting, the creak of cranes, the splash of ships hitting water. The whole place was laid out like a giant flowchart made of buildings. Raw materials came in one end, finished warships sailed out the other, and everything in between was organized with a precision that would make modern factory managers weep with envy. They had specialized buildings for every single step of the process. Timber yards where wood seasoned for years, foundries that cast cannon by the dozen, ropewalks that stretched for hundreds of feet, sail lofts bigger than aircraft hangars. This wasn't just impressive engineering. It was a complete rethinking of how things get made. Most medieval production was basically custom work. Every sword was unique. Every building was one of a kind. Every ship was built to whatever specifications the shipwright felt like using that day. The Arsenal threw all that out the window and embraced something radical: standardization. They created templates for everything: standard sizes for masts, ribs, and planks, standardized cannon that could fit on any ship. Even the oars were made to identical specifications, which meant that if a galley lost some oars in battle, any oars from any other Venetian ship would fit perfectly. It sounds obvious now, but back then, it was revolutionary thinking. The supply chain they built was equally impressive. Venice controlled forests across northern Italy, and they organized them like a massive timber farm. Trees were cut according to strict schedules, seasoned in purpose-built sheds, then transported to the arsenal when they were ready. Iron came from specific mines. Hemp for ropes was grown in designated fields. Pitch and tar were collected from partner regions. Everything was planned, measured, and delivered exactly when needed. But here's what made this system truly brilliant. They didn't just standardize the products, they standardized the process. Every ship followed the same construction sequence. First, workers would lay the keel and build the frame using those standardized templates. Then came the planking team, who would attach the hull boards and seal them watertight. Next, the rigging crew would step in to install masts and sails. Finally, the armament specialists would mount the cannons and load the supplies. Each team knew exactly what the previous team had done and exactly what the next team expected. No confusion, no delays, no arguments about whose job it was to do what. It was like a perfectly choreographed dance where everyone knew their steps and their timing. The workers themselves, called arsenalotti, became legendary throughout Europe. These weren't just labourers, they were skilled craftsmen who took enormous pride in their work. They had their own guild, their own traditions, and their own fierce loyalty to Venice. Some families worked in the arsenal for generations, passing down specialized techniques from father to son. The Venetians were so protective of their industrial secrets that the arsenal was basically a fortress within a fortress. High walls surrounded the entire complex. Guards checked everyone who entered, and foreign visitors were kept far away from the actual work areas. Spies were everywhere, trying to steal the techniques that made Venice's ship production so incredibly efficient. The security wasn't just about protecting trade secrets either. The arsenal was also Venice's main military base, storing thousands of weapons, tons of gunpowder, and supplies for the entire Venetian navy. One careless spark or one enemy saboteur could have destroyed the heart of Venice's military power. This combination of innovation, organization, and security created something the world had never seen before. The arsenal could repair damaged ships faster than anyone thought possible, retrofit old vessels with new weapons, and most impressively, build new warships at a pace that left other nations scrambling to keep up. When Venice needed a fleet, they didn't spend years begging shipwrights and hoping for the best. They just cranked up production at the arsenal and started counting the days until launch. The impact of this revolutionary approach to manufacturing would echo through history, influencing everything from firearms production to automobile assembly lines. But first, we need to understand exactly how this incredible machine worked, from the moment raw timber entered the gates to the second a fully armed galley slid down the slipway into the Venetian lagoon. The genius started with the layout itself. The arsenal wasn't just thrown together like most medieval workshops. It was designed like a giant machine, where materials flowed in one direction and finished ships sailed out the other. Picture a massive rectangle divided into specialized zones, each one feeding into the next like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. The timber yards sat at one end, massive open areas where thousands of logs lay aging under the Italian sun. These weren't random piles of wood. Every beam was sorted by size, quality, and seasoning time. Oak for the hulls, pine for the masts, special hardwoods for the oars. Some logs spent 5 years just sitting there, slowly drying and hardening, until they reached the exact moisture content the shipwrights demanded. Walking deeper into the complex, you'd hit the foundries next. These weren't your typical blacksmith shops. We're talking about industrial-scale metalworking facilities that could cast bronze cannons weighing over a ton each. The heat from these furnaces could be felt from hundreds of feet away, and the smoke from melting metal created its own weather system above the arsenal. Workers here weren't just making individual pieces. They were cranking out standardized cannon in batches, each one identical to the last. Then came the ropewalk, and this thing was genuinely impressive. Imagine a building stretching for over 1,000 feet in a perfectly straight line. That's longer than 3 football fields. Workers would start at one end with raw hemp fibers and walk the entire length, twisting and spinning, until they reached the other end with finished rope. The longest ropes for the biggest ships required men to walk over half a mile just to make a single line. These guys probably had the best cardio workout of anyone in medieval Europe. But here's where the arsenal got really clever. They didn't just make rope, they made standardized rope. Every thickness had a specific purpose. Every length was measured exactly, and every rope was tested to the same strength requirements. If a ship needed replacement rigging in the middle of the Mediterranean, any Venetian rope would work perfectly. No guessing, no measuring, no hoping it would fit. The sail lofts were equally impressive. Picture aircraft hangars filled with women. Yes, women did most of the sail work because they were considered better at the detailed stitching required. These weren't small sails either. The main sail on a Venetian galley was roughly the size of a tennis court, and it had to be sewn together from hundreds of strips of canvas with perfect precision. One crooked seam or loose stitch could mean the difference between catching wind and watching your sail tear apart in the first strong breeze. What made this whole system work was something that sounds boring, but was actually revolutionary: paperwork. The arsenal had clerks everywhere, tracking every piece of timber, every coil of rope, every cannonball. They knew exactly how much of everything they had, where it was stored, and when they'd need more. This wasn't just good organization, it was the birth of modern inventory management. Each workstation had detailed instructions written down, not just general guidelines, but specific measurements, exact techniques, and quality standards that had to be met. Workers couldn't just wing it or rely on experience. Everything was documented, tested, and verified. If someone made a mistake, the system caught it before it became a problem that could sink a ship. The flow of materials through the arsenal was like watching a perfectly timed relay race. As soon as one team finished their part of a ship, the next team was ready to jump in. No waiting around, no delays while someone figured out what came next. The whole operation moved with a rhythm that would make modern production managers jealous. The standardization extended to the tools themselves. Every hammer was the same weight. Every saw had the same tooth pattern. Every chisel was sharpened to identical angles. This meant that any worker could pick up any tool and know exactly how it would perform. No adjustments needed, no learning curve, no excuses for sloppy work. But the real magic happened on the slipways, the long ramps where ships were actually assembled. The arsenal had multiple slipways running parallel to each other, which meant they could build several ships simultaneously. While one galley was having its hull planked, the ship next to it was getting its mast stepped, and the one beyond that was being fitted with oars and weapons. The sequence was always the same. First came the keel, the backbone of the ship, laid out according to precise measurements that had been perfected over decades of trial and error. Then came the ribs, the wooden framework that gave the hull its shape. These weren't carved individually by some craftsman having a creative moment. They were cut using standardized templates that ensured every rib was identical and would fit perfectly with every other component. The planking came next, and this is where you could really see the efficiency of the system. Workers would arrive each morning to find stacks of boards already cut to size and shaped to fit. No measuring, no trimming, no head scratching about whether this piece would work. Every plank had been prepared in advance by specialists who did nothing but cut planks all day long. The caulking, stuffing the gaps between planks with oakum and tar to make them watertight, happened immediately after planking. The caulkers had their own specialized tools, their own techniques, and their own quality standards. They could seal a galley hull faster than most modern workers could caulk a bathroom. And their work had to be perfect because leaky ships don't stay afloat very long. Meanwhile, in parallel workshops, other teams were preparing the rigging, the sails, and the oars. By the time the hull was ready, everything else was waiting. The mast would be stepped, the rigging installed, the sails bent on, and the oars fitted in a coordinated dance that took just days instead of months. The armament was the final step. And this is where the Arsenal's military purpose became crystal clear. Cannons weren't just bolted onto ships randomly. They were mounted according to standardized designs that maximized firepower while maintaining the ship's balance and speed. Every galley carried the same types of weapons in the same positions, which meant that ammunition, spare parts, and tactical training were all standardized too. The final result was something that would have seemed impossible just a few decades earlier. A factory that could turn raw materials into finished warships faster than anyone thought possible, with a consistency and quality that made Venetian galleys the most feared ships in the Mediterranean. The numbers behind this operation would make your head spin. At peak production, the Arsenal was cranking out one fully equipped galley every single day. Not just on weekdays, every day. That's 365 warships per year when most kingdoms were lucky to build a handful. But here's the thing that really gets me. They weren't cutting corners or rushing through quality control. Each ship that rolled off their production line was better built than anything their competitors could manage, with months of careful craftsmanship. The workforce alone tells you how massive this operation was. 16,000 people worked inside those walls at the Arsenal's height. That's more than the entire population of most European cities back then. But these weren't just random labourers grabbed off the street. The Arsenalotti were the elite craftsmen of their time, specialists who'd spent years mastering their particular piece of the shipbuilding puzzle. Each worker had a specific job and stuck to it religiously. You had guys who did nothing but shape oar handles all day long. Others spent their entire careers just installing the iron fittings that held masts in place. There were specialists for canvas work, rope splicing, hull planking, and weapon mounting. This level of specialization was unheard of in medieval times, when most craftsmen were expected to know a little bit about everything. The Arsenal even had its own internal currency system. Workers were paid with special tokens that could only be spent at Arsenal-approved shops and taverns. This kept money flowing within the Venetian economy, while also preventing workers from taking their specialized knowledge and skills to competing shipyards. Pretty clever way to maintain both loyalty and secrecy at the same time. Quality control was obsessive by medieval standards. Every piece of timber was inspected before it entered the construction process. Every rope was tested for strength. Every cannon was proof-fired before installation. They had specialized inspectors whose only job was to make sure everything met Arsenal standards. If something didn't pass inspection, it got scrapped or sent back for rework. No exceptions, no matter how close to deadline they were. The testing procedures would impress modern manufacturers. New ship designs were put through rigorous trials before entering mass production. They'd load test galleys with weights to simulate full crews and cargo, then measure how they handled in different sea conditions. Speed trials, turning tests, stability checks, everything was documented and analysed before the design was approved for full-scale production. But what made the Arsenal truly revolutionary wasn't just the speed or quality, it was the flexibility. Traditional shipyards were basically locked into whatever they were building. If you started a merchant vessel, that's what you finished, even if military needs changed halfway through construction. The Arsenal could switch production on demand. Need more warships because tensions with the Ottoman Empire were heating up? No problem. Redirect materials and workers from civilian projects to military galleys within days. This adaptability came from their modular approach to construction. Hulls were built to accommodate different configurations of weapons, cargo, or crew quarters depending on mission requirements. A single basic design could become a troop transport, a cargo hauler, or a heavily armed warship just by changing out specific components during the final assembly stages. The arsenal's influence extended far beyond shipbuilding. Venetian merchants carried arsenal-trained techniques to other industries throughout Europe. The concepts of standardization, specialized labor, and systematic quality control started showing up in textile production, metalworking, and even agriculture. It was like watching the seeds of the Industrial Revolution being planted 3 centuries early. Foreign governments sent spies constantly, trying to steal the secrets that made Venice's ship production so incredibly efficient. Some got caught and faced serious consequences. The Venetians didn't mess around when it came to protecting their competitive advantages. Others managed to observe and report back. But understanding the system and actually implementing it were 2 completely different challenges. The arsenal's decline came gradually, starting in the late 1600s as trade routes shifted, and new naval technologies made traditional galleys obsolete. But its legacy lived on in ways the original builders never could have imagined. The assembly line principles perfected in those Venetian shipyards would eventually revolutionize manufacturing across every industry, from textiles to automobiles to electronics. The most mind-blowing part about all this: Venice figured out the secret source of modern manufacturing almost by accident. They weren't trying to revolutionize industry. They just wanted to build ships fast enough to keep their trade empire from getting steamrolled by the competition. But in solving that one problem, they accidentally invented concepts that wouldn't become mainstream until Henry Ford started mass-producing Model Ts. Think about it. Centralized supply chains, interchangeable parts, specialized labor, quality control systems, just-in-time delivery. All the buzzwords that modern business schools love to throw around were being practiced in a medieval Italian shipyard. The Arsenalotti were doing lean manufacturing before anyone even knew what that meant. The psychological impact on Venice's enemies was just as important as the ships themselves. Imagine being an Ottoman admiral and hearing intelligence reports that Venice could replace an entire fleet faster than you could repair the damage from a single battle. That's not just a military disadvantage. That's a complete game changer that makes you question whether fighting Venice is even worth attempting. But let's bust one myth that keeps getting repeated. The arsenal didn't literally build a complete galley from scratch every single day. That famous demonstration for King Henry III was probably a carefully orchestrated show using prefabricated components. What they could do every day was complete final assembly, outfit finished hulls with weapons and supplies, and launch fully operational warships. Still incredibly impressive, but not quite the miracle some historians make it out to be. The real miracle was their repair and retrofit capabilities. A damaged Venetian galley could sail into the arsenal in the morning and be back at sea by evening, completely restored and often upgraded with the latest weapons and equipment. This meant Venice's fleet stayed in fighting condition while their enemies' ships spent months in port getting patched up by traditional methods. What finally killed the arsenal wasn't competition or warfare. It was progress. By the 1700s, sailing ships had made galleys obsolete, and cannon technology had advanced beyond what the arsenal's standardized systems could accommodate. The very standardization that made them so efficient eventually became their weakness when the entire nature of naval warfare changed. But the ideas born in those Venetian workshops lived on. British naval yards adopted arsenal techniques during the Napoleonic Wars. American manufacturers studied Venetian methods when building the transcontinental railroad. Even today's automotive plants use principles that trace their roots back to those Italian shipwrights who figured out how to build better ships faster than anyone thought possible. The Venetian arsenal wasn't just a shipyard, it was humanity's first glimpse of what industrial production could become. In a world where everything was handmade and unique, they proved that standardization and systematic organization could create both efficiency and quality. They showed that the right combination of planning, specialization, and teamwork could accomplish things that seemed impossible. So the next time you're standing in a modern factory, watching products roll off an assembly line, remember those long-dead Venetian craftsmen who started it all. They took raw trees from Italian forests and turned them into floating fortresses that protected one of history's greatest commercial empires. Not bad for a bunch of guys working with hand tools and medieval technology. The Arsenal's legacy reminds us that innovation often comes from necessity, that the most revolutionary ideas can emerge from the most practical problems, and that sometimes the best way to change the world is to just focus on doing one job really, really well.